Hello everyone, today we talk about the islands in Gaul. I already made a video about this topic, looking at the island settlement, political siding, which was incredibly faithful to Rome, even abandoning some other foederati like the Visigoths that were attacking and conquering Roman towns, siding with essentially the local Roman government and or the one of Ravenna, fighting against the Huns and trying to preserve that Gallo-Roman continuity that in fact would be maintained in the region also during the Merovingian era, during which the latter of which the islands themselves were essentially absorbed in the system and settled down after the end of the Western Roman Empire, as many also units of both of the regular military and of the foederati, as these men were, through the hospitalitas, etc., to remain there, to be also revered. There are some interesting passages about this in Procopius, etc. We'll see it in another video, but this aspect is notorious. I hope at some point we will look at Britain as well, because that's, aside from the Arthurian legion, right, and the, say, this sense of mythological reality, still there is a historical one that shows the impact that those Sarmatians had on, in fact, British culture, exactly in the same way it had happened in Gaul, also with the development of the boosting, actually, of that idea that already existed in this Celto-Roman world, about the grandeur of what would have become the knight, objectively, and that was at the root of all, essentially, the Indo-European religions that, despite developing mostly in areas, demographically speaking, by the majority in sedentary Europe, and so we're talking here about millions in single provinces, etc., and so losing in great part any, say, nomadic lifestyle, just preserving some equestrian ideas, they did remember quite strongly. So there is all an anthropological analysis we could make, perhaps at some other point, talking about the Sarmatians. In general, the Iranian peoples, there are different ways you can classify the islands compared to the Sarmatians as a part of them or something separate. I made just recently, in the last couple of months, a series about Eurasian steppes warfare, right, that starts from the beginning, looking at all these waves of Indo-European conquerors that we all descend from, and that more especially we absorbed the cultural identity of them, right? Because we speak their language, we, in fact, still in a valorial system, we essentially draw from what are actually universal, of course, meaning also shared by other peoples, and we intertwine this deeply. But the degree by which Europe actually preserved this, it's difficult to talk about it in a concrete way, because it's something you feel more than you actually can explain to a degree, because you would have at least to go as far as saying, what do I feel like to be European? How do I feel towards war? How do I feel towards God? And these are all things that, when you look at European literature, folklore, etc., history, you discover to be markedly different and dramatically, markedly different from from those peoples in the world, at least from which also that do not have that degree of European influence historically. So I talk about the West actually as a whole, rather, compared to the rest of the world, and that is also felt dramatically close, I think, to the current times. So there is much more than at least what we think, this thing being buried somewhere, right, together with this nomadic men-at-arms. And that, in my opinion, can be observed simply by the degree of Western growth, expansion, development to a macroscopical degree that just a myopic vision, of course, the one devoid of actual culture, history, and education, can unsee, which is absolutely typical also for the average person who lives in the West today. Yes, the average person who lives in the West today is better than any other average person, whichever other part of the world out there. But it's still dramatically oblivious. So you always see that even among people that call themselves conservatives or traditionalists, that there's actually not a historical or religious or just even scientific, because this gets down to hardcore reality, literacy about these topics, right? It seems just like a strange, exotic thing to talk about the islands in Gaul, right? These were just they didn't even leave a trace as a single realm like the other Romano-Germanic ones, etc., because there were less. So I made multiple videos about the islands at this point, and we'll keep talking about them. And what strikes you of these people emerging from the Tian Shan, the Heavenly Mountain, and so the peak actually of Iranian, properly, let's say, Indo-European creed, at least in a military sense, right? That's what we notice historically. These guys provided bodyguards to practically all the great empires out there, the Romans, and stretching over an incredible amount of time. We're talking the Mongols, so surviving mostly and contained north of the Caucasus, but having scattered, in fact, during the migration era after the Hunnic invasion, and leaving actually these traces that are greater than you usually think in toponomastic or just onomastics in Europe of the same. Think about the Great Dane, that was actually the island dog as such. The even in fact legions like the Arthurian ones, the Excalibur, the Sword in the Stone, the Kurgans, right? That's all one, So that's how deeply ingrained it is, and how, say, unrecognized it is. Like, it's mostly also used in a nationalistic sense, like saying this was my people or whatever, surely, no offense, but I don't think that the Ossetians look or just own a culture is very much like what the island one was, right? There's no doubt that they descend from them in many ways, but things change, right? And you cannot say in that sense claim just that you are that if you literally do not even know very often basic history and pretend that this is a sort just of matter, say genes without awareness, right? Spirit is superior to matter, right? And there is a transfigurational capacity, and as I was saying before, this is something that some peoples in the world achieved historically and others failed in, right? And you gotta reflect on this, because also the islands disappear in many ways. But where's their legacy exactly? Where does it lay? I think it lays greatly in the cauldron of Western civilization. I make lots of videos in which I explain also some of you ask me, but we want to know about your ideology, your thing. It's something that I advise to people and they reject it, whatever. It's a complex thing. I could do it in another video. But the ideology is the typically traditional one. If you have power, you wield it, right? Essentially, there are a bunch of alienated people nowadays that pretend to be conservatives by, claiming to be just average people, without accomplishing anything, without taking control themselves, by saying, well, civilization ruins everything. It does not, right? People failing as human beings, not being able to wield civilization and conquering the world, are what ruined everything, right? Civilization is what the Holy Ghost, the winged glory, manifests like, right? If you're not worth that, of course, you will be a whining Fort estater that thinks that there is the terrible elite up there. So living in a chthonic, deterministic, materialistic, relativistic, of course, superstition, which is the actual etymological meaning of the world, and enjoying the dirtiness of being a human being, which, in case you wondered, even there, etymologically speaking, means literally dirty, right, from humus, right? It's the same thing. So And it had a very specific meaning, as we will see now, also in the Alan Creed. These were people who believed that if you did not achieve and conquer and die in holy combat, you were worthless, because literally they knew that they disappeared after that they had not been worthy the shot of their existence, right? So instead of, again, whining because, oh my god, rationalization in civilization, it's your failure, right? It's, of course, in great part today of everybody's failure. And the beauty of this is that it's a collective responsibility. But there is no joke here. This doesn't flatter anyone, right? Because tradition is that precise, simple, clear, straightforward. There are no shortcuts. There are no, but I thought I was a good person because, I don't know, I exist. No, right? It doesn't work like that. You're a fallen kind. If you're not able to become God yourself, which I don't know anybody around from a while being able to do, well, I think that you should better reflect about your failure, you're finding your limits and understanding what it means to be in this condition, and then starting to work silently and hard, right, without complaining about your condition specifically, because that's pathetic. That's the most unmanly way you can cope with reality, right? One thing is assessing your own failure, that's fine, but whining about it is ridiculous, right? And you would have been spit on by these people, and probably also, with some good motivation. So the beauty of Alan history also lays in this actual recognition of Roman authority. This is enormous because it shows that they had wanted to partake the imperium, as in fact it was the ultimate traditional goal. There was no national and or socialistic mental delirium for which, I don't know, there was something like a people separated from another, right? Here we're talking about transcendence. We're talking about something that goes beyond human nature, right? That's the stage, right, of somebody dignity, right? Not humanity. And their stupid factionalism. Rome had objectively succeeded in restoring the Golden Age, the Golden Era. This is debatable exclusively on the basis on how you interpret specifically Christianity, and even here, the most correct thing is saying that definitely Rome has surpassed to this day by far any other people, country, whatever, by magnitudinal scale, to the point that everybody who eventually created an empire essentially was calling themselves Roman. Then after we abandoned, of course, we fell to the further standard, especially after the crisis of universal powers at the end of the Middle Ages. With the rise of the nation state, of course, this is completely impossible to achieve anymore. So people did not identify as Romans anymore, but the Germans did, right? The kings of the Romans, the Holy Roman Emperors on the battlefield, as in German said, "Here's Rome," right? That was their battle cry. So that's just think, living this in the 5th century, in the 6th century, not even in the 13th, where this quote is from. And so understanding the greatness, right, of not just what Rome had been, but of your own accomplishment to the degree, of course, in which the Alans had dominated the steppes. Back in the day, they had basically hegemonized the entire system, where in another. And they had been pushing west because, of course, that's where most resources laid on in the same empire, at least in an easier fashion. Like, the eastern steppes, yes, you have China from the other side, but they're much less hospitable. They were a bit like the ghetto of the steppes in the first place. That's also where the Turks and the Mongols came from after just according to traditional prophecy, things like start to have everything declines because of our fallen nature. So the spiritual trigger there is that also Christianity embodies is challenging anything earthly to restress the spiritual aspect. The same with Buddhism. Buddha was, of course, coming from the military class, and the objective was, of course, conquering the world according to his Vedic background. So he was not claiming for peace, for this other bullshit, if not in actual form of world domination. and complete subjugation of the world, and just, returning to that moral standard that had been at the root of this all. This was a great problem for the sedentary civilizations and the nomads that had actually always been the weakest, right? And actually, when we look at these peoples, these empires, the Achaemenids, Alexander, Rome, these were all products of Indo-European nomads that had actually settled in the respective regions and had maintained to some higher standard, essentially hegemonizing also culturally the local population, as I was saying before, right? The Indo-Europeans were the minority, but they say we speak their language exactly. For the success of their own superiority, Rome had done most of the job in this regard, and the Alans regarded that as essentially the most identifying point. If you are bred in the steppe to that degree of universal overlordship and imperial superiority, right, that had allowed you to take over the entire Iranian world, you would naturally search for a hierarchical equivalent of your own force, and Rome was also greater, as the Alans recognized it's just being taken over by the Huns, right? And of course, the Roman Empire, even in the time of Attila, was a superior civilization by far that the Huns would have never, in fact, even remotely succeeded in taking over. Right? They were completely illiterate in that sense. The Alans weren't. The Germans weren't also. So here, what we have seen is actually a conflict, a competition between the Alans and the Germans. Right? The Alans actually consider themselves to be superior to the Germans. They abandon them. They side with Rome. And they actually get an elective role in the control of Gaul. We've seen this all in the previous video. You have it here in the comment, in the top fixed comment below the list of related videos. You can easily find it anyway. And as such, they had been provided by the empire. They had been entrusted the control of the deep lines of defense in Gaul that had to do mostly with the northeast in Belgica, but also with Armorica, as we will see also today, where some of them had settled, and also partly in the southwest. We can trace all this through toponymy. We see a lot of Alan, land, whatever, in literal French towns that still exist and that reveal through archaeology, through our understanding of also where the Roman and auxiliary forces were stationed at the time, how this people was settled in which strategic function, right? And as such, the Alans played essentially the inner. Actually, they had a superior role because the Germans were left mostly at the outskirts of this as the first line of defense. The best ones, the mobile force, the elite force, because there were also less. The Germans normally were an entire people, right, with tens of thousands of warriors. The Alans, as we will see, probably had less than that, consistently less than that. And they were placed in the very heart of France, Orléans, from which they could depart from, the northeastern frontier, the Rhone Valley, also Aquitaine, or down the Loire in Armorica, so countering the Bacchaudi, so keeping actually the entire Gallo-Roman building functioning, also because, as we've seen, they had since the beginning been installed as lords through the hospitalitas in these places, a bit like, say, not just in Gaul, the Visigoths or the Franks, but the same Ostrogoths in Italy, etc. So as the army, right, and the rest of society working exactly as it had been working before, right? So in the case of Orléans, we know that some Roman landowners had to abandon this place and they went to other places in Gaul where Romanity was actually very strong, especially in the south, but society remained exactly what it was. And in fact, Gallo-Roman society is famously continuing in the Merovingian system that also understood this continuity as the key of any possible power. As a Roman legacy, Clovis really takes on everything as possible as far as that imperial mandate. He converts, as you know, straight from paganism to Catholicism. So this also would make the Merovingian Empire the most successful, would strip even the Goths, the leadership of Western Europe as a consequence. So this all to say that the Alans had an elite and privileged position that was highlighted, as we explained in depth in the other video, by a constant loyalty to Rome, right? They could simply start trying to carve something for themselves, regardless of, say, imperial authority. They wouldn't, right? They always stuck. The only time which they stopped doing so is when, so at the time of Ricimer, when everything was falling apart, when Majoran had already been defeated, so that say Gaul and Italy would always remain very close, but culturally, also ecclesiastically, politically. But of course, at that point, the unity of the Western administrative bloc was coming less, right? So at that point, the Alans, yes, are reported to be, in some places, at least carving up their own signature, but up to that point, they had been even fanatically loyal, right? Think about the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. So, of course, there was a convenience for them because they had now settled in Gaul. So, the interests matched, right? They weren't doing it so just for Rome in an absolute sense. At least we should have asked them, because it depends what they actually believed regarding the Imperium and how this overlapped with Rome at that point. Surely the Alans, in this sense, were recognized as upholding the Imperium, as being given that that lordship, right, as auspices, right? So, but unfortunately, we can't interview them. But history here speaks clearly, and everything adds up to that to this frame. In any case, today we talk a bit about what these Alans also were, right? Alans had eventually been settled for military purposes in Gaul. There were surely civilians. I'd say with them, at least civilian is a big word. In this word, there was no real difference, especially among the Alans, among those who lived in the Barbaricum, between, say, the military men and the civilian ones, because, you know, there are just, as we'll see now, a category of people that don't fight, but they're either just the women or the too young or too old men, right? So there, dichotomically, there is, of course, the exclusion of women from fighting, at least on an overwhelming basis. The idea that women out there fought everywhere, the Vikings, it's all a pile of garbage, right? There were, but this hasn't anything to do with a categorical, normal, habitual amount of women just involved into fighting because it was their culture. This is just actually neo-Nazism in multicultural disguise. It has nothing to do with those cultures who were brutally and rigidly and traumatically and violently, and fortunately so, patriarchal, also because they could have not worked in any other way. And that's what their greatest pride, identity, and strength. In many ways, this is not to say that that it's advisable for women to live like that also today or another time, but you must contextualize why it worked like that at a time, right? And if you don't know that, of course, you can't believe that bullshit, because you can't believe anything, right? You must be a heavily historically educated person in order to make certain assessments. If you aren't, I'm sorry, but that's not how it works, right? History is a serious thing. Stupid people are not a serious thing. Just remember that. And let's especially get out of the way simply that the story that an average person's opinion matters anything. It doesn't matter anything, right? Free speech is a thing, but the words of opinion is a completely different thing, right? So if you do not understand that, I suggest you get a first world primary education, then work for a good 20 years, spitting blood, sweating tears, and then maybe you can dream to afford to think that your opinion has any minimal relevance in the world, right? That's how it works, and how it worked for millennia, right? The reason why we live in this world is unfortunately the aforementioned degeneration of mankind that progresses further since the fall from the heavenly status. In any case, as we were saying, the Alans were a militarized people, because out there in the Barbaricum you simply didn't have enough resources to survive without killing, raping, enslaving, and that's what all peoples out there did without any difference. Like the difference with civilization, that it does also other things except that, right? And that's still, it grows under that, recognition that in fact there is an individual worth to be at least pursued, right? So that we set the standards to avoid living like that, but there are also dangers in as much as they soften up dramatically, because they basically take away our sense of reality, right? Trying to exercise the negative things that pain, suffering. Well, that's not a good recipe for survival. But of course, for a fallen kind, living out there as all peoples in the world did, killing, enslaving and raping, is actually a product of the fall. So as evil itself, there is nothing romantic or poetic, or people live such beautiful lives. No, they were terrible lives, and that's the reason why they migrated also in the Roman Empire, by the way. The Alans were primarily warriors, right? All of whom were noble and capable of holding kingship. Alans, right? The etymology is the same of Aryan, means noble, right? Regarding slavery, I said now that the Alans enslaved as well, of course, they did. Ammianus contends that slavery was, however, unknown among them, which actually means that the Alans did enslave and did sell. And there was a florid, actually, slave trade going on in the Pontic steppe under rule, whatever. What Ammianus means is that they wouldn't use slaves in a sort of parasitic way, right? They felt that their only way of life was fighting and being self-sufficient, fundamentally. They did have their retinues, right? We know that because just the way they fought, their ultra elite of heavily armored horsemen, of course, required lots of other people, lots of other Alans, and different degrees of of freedom, because there was no such thing like an absolute right. It was always a hierarchy of vows, but the and quality of people. But Ammianus, of course, was reasoning from a world that was much more heavily stratified from a social point of view. Slavery actually had not been so numerous in the empire at this point like it had been in previous times, at least if you intend what was slavery differs like from serfdom. So the Alans appeared as a sort of very unstratified people where everybody was sort of free and warlike, etc. But there were actual differences. Of course, there were less than among other peoples. This is also debatable. Telling the truth, for example, compared to the Germans, etc., because the Alans too had been pursuing a seigneurial lifestyle back then. They did lord over other peoples. It's just they didn't consider themselves as part of them. Right? This is an important difference. So we will again look at this in other videos, but again, there hadn't been the sense that everybody had been elevated by Alan rule in the steppe to the point of all being Alans, right? They still kept this sort of, if you want, even paranoid. This is true also for the Spartans, for whomever was trying to maintain that sort of isolated elite by dramatically increasing their standards, also in war. In any case, the Huns overwhelmed the Alans, and surely those weren't that so elitary like the Alans, but just by sheer mass were able to crack that Iranian steppes empire. So this is the time, as you know, in which the Indo-European steppes is overwhelmed by the Turks and the Mongols later, and so on. In any case, the Alans were, as you understand, primarily horsemen. Even the armored ones, let's say, they spent most of their time fighting and hunting. There was, again, in all this, Ammiano's description is quite categorical, but there was a sense of lordship, there was some sedentarism, there was some other activity, right, trade, whatever. This had been wiped out, however, by the Hunnic invasions. So that war, that had definitely always been the Alan favorite occupation, had been somehow turned back to some primal order, right? Just to explain you what it was talking about before, it was said, in fact, about the Alans that only a man who died in battle was regarded as happy among them. What does this mean? It means that, of course, if there was no attempt of transcendence in holy combat, which was considered the preferential gateway to heaven, the chances of transfiguring, of being at least projected to a world of a sort of limbo that would have brought, like a bit Libalala or Similia, that would have eventually contributed to the struggle of God against the forces of evil in the end time, could not be achieved, right? The equivocal, say, when you look at Valhalla, that is already like in Norse tradition. Norse tradition was very advanced, very, very secular already, very degenerated from the origins. This was still true when you read about purgatory, right? So these cultures in the first millennium, they had already developed the sense that it was incredibly difficult to save oneself, right? To be God themselves. Like if you look at Mithras or Aruna or all these myths that display the capacity of even the most say basic, like the most fallen kind to actually made it to be God, become God themselves, was lost, right? That's why Christianity had kicked in, why these ideas were already shared on a universal basis. And so they believed at least that dying in battle was considered, in this ranking in front of God, was already, say, thought not as simply the absolute truth, but also some sort of more personified concept. Would have, and this is difficult to say about the Alans because we don't have the actual evidence, but generally speaking, this was the way they would, in fact, also say transfer their own belief into Christianity. That was just, again, a different stage of the same religion, contrarily to what people, again, that especially are paranoid about Semitic stuff, I have to point out about, by the way, a religion that as soon as it spread in Europe acquired all the most radically brutal Indo-European Roman literally militaristic values, right? This is notorious and was also at the root of the further knightly and holy war revival of the Middle Ages. So more of that to think. And surely the Alans contributed to some injection of some perhaps more traditional view on certain aspects, but surely their dream to die in battle was connected with the hope that would be some sort of, if not enough, right? Because evidently they realized that these chiefs, this nobleman, whoever died in battle, did not just appear in the sky, did not just turn the world in a different way. There was, again, Rome. From the other side, they were actually within it because they thought the empire was that universal. And they were just all trying to partake this greater thing, right? And proving their own valor in a ranking that eventually would have turned out already in a eschatological perspective to a different degree of heavenly accomplishment, right? In fact, those who met a less violent death were considered to have been either degenerate or cowardly. Right, remember this, right? You want to emulate the Alans, you want to be like them, you want to be the stream of you thinking that you can go out there in 2023 and thinking to be this free warrior riding on the French countryside, with blonde hair, unleashed over, his cuirass, whatever. Just know that if you do not live by the sense that if you don't die in holy combat, you're a degenerate and cowardly, may want to make you reconsider, the disgusting standard that an Alan would have found about you. Right, and again, a degree of shame that probably would be enough to make you bury yourself into what likely will be our collective end by this stage of degeneration. So those men who were either too young or too old to fight, an activity for which they had to be initiated properly, at least the younger ones, worked around the wagons, also helped the women, so they were not considered fully men, also because normally they got a different name, a different status, a different identity proper as warriors. The Alans' military orientation was manifested both in their political organization and in their creed, right? They believed that, of course, existence was a perpetual war. This again was essentially the belief that existed in the world at the time, that the only purpose was conquering the world. The only purpose of existence is because it can't save humanity collectively from the fallen kind. And they had all a series of practices that, of course, intertwined, like in all religions in the first place, Uranian and telluric aspects, right? The aforementioned sword in the stone seems to have derived exactly from the Alan tradition of fixing a naked sword that was, by the way, the alter ego of the warrior, just like in Roland, that by dying doesn't think about his beloved woman at home that is crying for him, but if he just thinks and brags about his sword, right? Fixing this in his bare earth, and let's say at that point becoming there is an interesting chthonic dimension too, because especially Roman religion explains this well. There is a genius in the soma, right? Essentially in the mortal spoils. So if you wonder even where the idea of the sanctity of relics, etc., it's not a superstition. That's what they believe themselves. Of course, it was a contempt towards anything terrestrial, but since they believed that everything had to come back to the one, together with the entire world, this would essentially be true for matter. That's why also for Catholicism, for Christianity, we are to be resurrected if, of course, God succeeds in the flesh. So that flesh is not a bad thing. It's just a product of our own sin, but it's only through it that we can come back to the one, right? So that you understand also why Gnosticism is a disgusting, irresponsible heresy, and why these people cared about the genome, the blood, literally the one especially of the clan, from which it was thought that were, in all this various degree of worth of human beings, some better predisposed, biological matter that, of course, was all one with the spirit as well, and so that if you worshipped, for example, these on this mount, the fallen warrior, you would have gotten by proximity of this earth through decomposition, etc. It's some spirit of it as well, because the spirit had abandoned actually the body, and at least there were two. If one had succeeded in transfiguring, he would, of course, ascend to the sky, just like in the Roman apotheosis. Another one was just essentially wandering around, in case of failure, wandering around on the earth and then disappearing after a while, but the soma remained. And so we find this plenty. There is also in Celtic culture, the Irish mounds, again, it's very common, and it's also how the entire history of relics, etc., if you think that these did not exist before Christianity, I hope you may want to quickly go to read some history of religion. And Ammianus, that is the source for most of this Alan culture, identity, practice, essentially reveals the true meaning, right, of it all, right? To them, even to the Romans of the later empire, was clear what this practice really meant, because there were similar ones in Rome, just to a different degree. The Alans had been living a mostly nomadic life on the steppes for centuries, but those who fled before the Hunnish advance during the last decades of the fourth moved west in search of a new home. That's how they had arrived in Gaul after the crossing on the frozen Rhine 406, together with other people they had mixed with, because again, the Alans had been shattered. They were not moving like a single people, but they fragmented and scattered across Europe from Sarabia to Portugal. They reached North Africa with the Vandals, but they were just groups, right? Elite groups, by the way, possibly even constituting some the spearhead of these other mostly Germanic peoples. Naturally, there were many among them also what would have been the Slavs, also Romanized Celtic populations, etc. Sure, there were also other groups of Turks that had been pushed by west by the same Huns, etc. A very complex mechanism that we will perhaps see better in detail in another video. So we have seen these various figures of Alan leaders in the previous video. Gaul is one of them. He, together with his followers, entered Gaul some 30 years after the destruction of the Alan steppe empire. So this was the next generation. It's fascinating because they were born when the people were still migrating. So they had been surely imagining what the world had been before, what their enormous pride. There was some similar feeling about this among what would have become the Ostrogoths later on, their florid Pontic kingdom on the Black Sea, destroyed by the same Huns, etc. So in a way or another, together with this new migration, their previous practice, and just the memory, the legacy of their own people, their identity, they had maintained part of their previous nomadic lifestyle, together with their military prowess. And there was surely a point in which they had a debate over the necessity of living essentially as sedentaries instead of roaming from pasturage to pasturage, right? This is actually much less controversial than it seems. All these steppes peoples had been trying to settle down at some point to rule over what they saw as this enormous world of riches that the sedentary civilizations controlled. So, as you know, the Sarmatians had been harassing the Roman Empire from Europe and Asia for quite a while, but they hadn't managed to break through. Right now, the gates were open. At some point, they were also incentivized to settle down by the same imperial authorities, like in this case, and especially their military prowess was quite appreciated. As we've seen through the toponomastic evidence, the settlement, the Alan settlement in Gaul was pretty substantial, right? Again, there weren't as many as single Germanic groups that would form later on monarchies right on their own, also through Roman mediation, as you know, the Visigoths, through among which the Alans were in part. Defecting them in Gaul had been created essentially as the Roman army of Illyricum, together with the the monarchy there. That was something that the Germans didn't like at all, or at least they had never developed to that level of that would reach, in fact, in Romania. So with Alaric, etc. So what the thing that strikes you the most from a toponomastic and say jointly with a historical point of view is how many Alan place names have remained in the localities in which the Alans settled, right? Because they were a few after all. And so this tenacity surely speaks of the incredible sense of themselves that these warriors had, right? They truly had an incredibly strong identity, and they boasted this against these other groups that they evidently thought less of them, and that would always maintain also the pride of the locals, because as we will see now, these guys had settled as lords in places that were in fact already habituated to be under some lords of some sort, either the Gallo-Roman senators or some other foederatus, right? So having such prestigious landlords meant really a lot. I made a video about the sense of, say, spiritual, the sense of chivalric values, say, absorbed by the concept of Christian sainthood in post-Carolingian times, the fact that there was a sort of providential, of course, metaphysical role that a feudal role lord performed in society and in the world as such. And that was defending, of course, the local population, say, reinforcing these districts through the success of their military enterprises. Of course, there were Romans that were fighting or assisting, especially as serfs, as field aides, etc., these steppe warriors. Of course, these were just a minority, demographically speaking. It is true that some areas of Gaul had been depopulated, but as we've seen, the Alans actually controlled still some of the most central areas of Gaul, where Romanity would keep on living for a very long time, and also being at the basis of great part of the French monarchy accomplishments under the Franks and so on. We know, because I made a video about the Merovingian army organization. We know that there were Roman militias, there were, again, units of the Roman army that had been previously stationed there that kept remaining, especially the Limitanei, but not only, right? Actual field units, right, that continued to be distinguished, by the way, from the others by their own, and respected in that world. So this would happen for the Alans, for sure. And the continuity of habitation is definitely telling us that these nomads had finally sedentarized by this point, and not only. We will see how far this assimilation went. The Alans in this were surely aware of the system of hospitalitas. They wanted to share the fruits of the local estates. We have a pretty concrete idea of how such such mechanism would happen. The Alans were perfectly acquainted with the Roman military already, not just because they had fought against them, but also for them, right? Sarmatian auxiliaries had already been stationed in various parts of the empire, so it was surely well known how all this mechanism worked and how to cope with them. These weren't savage, brutal beasts, right, that were not to keep order or discipline. Actually, they had very high military quality, and as such, they were necessarily orderly and disciplined and well organized, right? So they fit well, again, what the Romans gave them. By 451, as we've seen, there was an Alan king in Orléans, ruling, so basically the heart of France, and having this most central strategic position to put down the Baccaudae revolts, to back the German foederati in the northeast, to even intervene in the south of Gaul whenever there was a need for that. And especially we see that they had even adopted a urban life, right? At least in that case, one of Gaul's more important cities, and the other ones that, in spite of the decline of late antiquity, were still, standing and also putting up quite a struggle or resistance against invaders of any kind. And that in fact, the Alans themselves contributed. At some point, they found themselves to defend these cities from the same hands. You know how important bishops were in the cities. So this is the other interesting thing. We see a dichotomy that would last throughout the entire Middle Ages. The lay lord, that can be a pagan even in this case, and the Christian bishop cooperating for the lay lord, mostly in charge of the military, but the bishop also supplying the military, organizing it, and also leading. This would be typical in Gaul from a very early age, of actually leading the same city army, right, and providing for the garrisons, the repairs of the city walls at Semilia. The Alans here appeared, of course, mostly as a mobile force with their shock cavalry. It was possibly the top one existing at the time. The Romans had replicated artificially at a point the Eastern and Iranian cataphracts, but with not great success, right? The Romans had actually great cavalry throughout their entire history, contrary to what is normally thought, but the cataphracts especially did not succeed particularly. These were the actual guys coming from the steppes, the ones out from which they had modeled essentially their type of warfare. We always think mostly of the Parthians or the Sasanians, but actually the steppes dimension, the Eastern European frontier is the one we try to overlook dramatically. They influenced much more even later with the Avars that, for example, introduced the stirrup in Europe, etc. The development of what we call, say, the medieval knight, way more than, say, the Parthians or later the Crusades actually did, right, from the Near East. Also because Europe always had a hell of an equestrian culture, as we were saying before, among the other things. So actually there were good Gallo-Roman cavalrymen in the places where the Alans settled, and they cooperated as well, and they surely improved their own their own capacities, because thinking about just all the Zootechnic skills that were brought by the Alans from a much more brutally compact and more highly performing military situation. So they were already similar to one another, because again there had already been a lot of influence through these nomadic steppes over the centuries. But Gaul, and this is interesting thinking about the flower of French cavalry during the Middle Ages, the sense of this enormous sense of lordship, of highness, of superiority, of hierarchy, of ematophilia, of angelic incarnation, the sacrality of kinship, and so on, surely was also, not decisively, but consistently, we want to think, influenced by the Alans, right, among the others, because as we will see, these guys would become Merovingian, Carolingian lord. I mean, great part of the local nobility was surely married into them, as we will see now, because there is a source that says it explicitly, especially for Brittany and Neustria. The Alans also surely maintained their own equestrian specialties throughout this entire time, also because essentially by the early Middle Ages, cavalry surpassed infantry in importance, right? It was not yet decisive on it. It would be just for a couple of centuries, telling the truth, during the Middle Ages. But in a country like Gaul, especially much, because while the Franks, it is true, originally didn't have much of a cavalry compared to other, especially Eastern Germanic peoples, when they settled in Gaul, and given that, again, the Roman estates had largely remained intact, this is true also for Spain. In Italy and Britain, things would change in a different way. they began to afford, right, just that ultra elite that could quickly develop a sense of, mounted, armored warrior as essentially the emblem of the establishment of the government, of the ruling class, let's say, and this surely would develop further in what we see best in Carolingian times. It was already strong, actually, quite early, and surely the Alans had contributed to that as well, right? Again, the Gallo-Roman magnates at this point fought as heavy cavalry, in some cases as cataphracts, right? There is a much greater autonomy now, also in terms of equipment, personal, customized arms and armor, etc., than, say, when just there were those fixed legions on the frontier and everything was managed from the outer side. And cavalry was, of course, increasing importance as well. It was also, as we will see now, a mode of life, right? The Romans had always practiced that sense of what they called as altium, that actually had a lot to do with the way now also this, dedication in a much more troubled world to military matters, single leaders, single lords was part of this still functioning elite that had not been beheaded by social collapse would have developed further. We know that the Alan cavalry was quite compact, right? Especially in the shock power, they had, of course, horse archers, and sometimes they still combine the two things, which is typical of the most radically intense steppes lifestyle that tended to be abandoned over time for a greater functionalization of just heavy and light cavalry. But you find these functions mixed among those who could still maintain those higher standards to do both at the same time. And their look was surely fierce and terrifying on the battlefield. It was a military machine molded in one of the single most unspeakably violent contexts in the history of mankind, so everything was functional to that prowess. The Alans were required to maintain their military way of life. First of all, in order to satisfy their obligations to the empire, because otherwise they would have not even had the capacity of being provided by the Romans with that power they had locally. That's, however, when they also had to deal with, for the first time, with a truly sedentary life, by the way, in one of the most advanced regions in Europe. So handling these estates, administering them, keep preserving them, and apparently they were also good at this, because they, for the first time, so imagine you're deprived of something you wanted so much for so many times, then you finally get it. At least at the beginning, you're being, oh my God, we're being so lucky. We deserve this. We earned this. Let's keep it now. Well, for a while. Then, of course, as you know, the Alans do not survive as a distinct group with distinct beliefs, but the general development of feudal France, right, is also, of course, soaked in that sort of militaristic and imperialistic identity. I mean, the French monarchy was actually an empire throughout all its existence. And of course, the Alans would have kept essentially fighting because they had now all those people functionally working for them. After all, that's what the hospitalities really was. You got 1/3 of the agricultural income that was destined to the army, right? So they just controlled the most important productive centers. These were already functionalized to provide with resources. I mean, the arms and armory production, etc., was all seen. The cities here are key even for this initially nomadic force. So everything was already working from Roman times in the best way. They would simply allow the substitution of the Alans to the now vanished Roman military there. Campaigns were quite expensive, right? Gaul was, as we've seen, penetrated by these peoples in 406. Some of them had ravaged many places, but as we were noticing, there hadn't been quite a structural disaster like it would happen elsewhere. And the Alans wanted to preserve the system now they had settled there. They continuously trained in horsemanship. They also integrated with local Gallo-Romans for practicing rigorous tactical maneuvers, also together with infantry, right? And again, the Alans weren't the only ones fighting here. There were lots of Gallo-Romans that participated to the system. Surely for the elite, for the nobility, for those who really fought as the shock element of the army, this collective training was a full-time occupation. That's what essentially a medieval knight does, right? Continuous training for a lifetime, and only that's the only valuable thing, as we've seen, that a man worth of this name can do with his life. Training and fighting, also for real. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, the Alans held the center of the Roman array, right, indicating that also substantial numbers of Alans were in active service. We do not know exactly how many Alans were present at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Conservative estimates can make us think of something like 5,000-6,000. Likely mostly cavalry, at least the decisive element within their own force, surely having to do with this balance, right? And in any case, the military nature, and this is very interesting in a global Roman perspective, meaning that we think at some point the other peoples arrived, they planted their flag somewhere and said, this is another country. They weren't actually reasoning like that, and nor the Romans were, meaning that to them, like we don't have actually evidence of Alan law, right? The Burgundians legislated, the Visigoths did, and so on. But we know that Aetius, for example, when settling the Burgundians, right, after they had been crushed by the Romans and their Hunnic mercenaries, by the way, on the Middle Rhine, famously enough, has all the story of the Nibelungen and so on, were deported in Sepaudia in the south, where eventually the kingdom of the Burgundians would have emerged. And even as a defeated people, they were settled as still sense of a field military of some sort, because they were provided with that, again, basis of hospitalitas that entailed Roman subjects working for them, right? This is crucial to understand, even if they were defeated, right, and severely so, because the Burgundians would never recover much of a power on their own. The Franks would remain strong, the Visigoths would remain strong, etc. The Burgundians were defeated people. They had never been actually quite so performing even before. They had been defeated by different ones, by the Vandals, etc. But they still so were conceived by the Romans as a sort of upper class of people that it was useful to count on as soldiers, as military, that thus had to be maintained by colonists, right? Gallo-Roman ones inhabiting those areas. Surely there were some Germans that ended up working like that, also because there were slaves among the same Germans and Serbs, etc. So there would be a mix of that. But still, the idea that this were an elite, both numerically and to a level of militarization compared to the rest of the populace, survived in this case. And so when you look at the Alans, and especially the role they had at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, and the fact that they literally saved the Romano-Germanic forces against the Huns and their Germanic allies, also from the other side, they really were covered in glory like this. They really lived to fulfill some of the greatest glory that you could expect at that point. I mean, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains was basically the last big battle would be fought in Gaul for a long time. Religiously wise, there weren't assimilation problems either, right? Aside from some Christian author that complained about the initial paganism of the islands by describing their customs, etc. Surely were quite different from, evangelical ritual, etc. That there is no trace of violence, right, of brutal resistance or persecutions, anything like that. First of all, the islands were not in the position of doing so, right? Even the those Aryans that constituted the bulk of the populations, like the Visigoths, the formed actual kingdoms, regional political territorial powers, did not actually persecute the broader population. If anything, they fought against one another. These were, say, pagan or Catholic, were fundamentally just two factions within the elites about how to run things that had barely to do with the general principle of behind the theological difference that also was beyond most of them. Likely, there was actually a meaning right to it. At some point I will make another video to explain it better than I've already done elsewhere. But again, this story that basically 90% of also the channels that talk about the late antiquity and migration era have to feed you with is that there was this sort of terrible religious struggle because there are these radically different beliefs that were categorically opposed to one another, and it was this dark, tremendous thing that happened in the form of Christianity affirming itself, or paganism that would have been allegedly something terrible and just persecutory. It was none of this stuff, right? It was a much, not just much more complex and political issue, but again, it was just about accepting a different stage of the same religious awareness, given the reality of the world for what it was shown at the time. So the end of the Golden Era, the end of the empire that had repristinated heavenly rule. So if people like Augustus or Constantine, etc., had not made it, right, to make this thing survive till the end time, and still Romanity was understood to be the pillar around which the entire world revolved, the idea was that there was this further stage to that would even technically not change much, because Christianity doesn't tell you that it's really only about faith, right? There is a debate in this because, of course, since Paul, Augustine, Luther throughout Christian history, but it's a liminal concept. It of course works were thought to be the actual deal. If you actually had managed to win your human nature and transfigure the world, you would have accomplished it. And this was felt to be beyond now the capacity of individuals, whereas we were saying before, even though it was potentially achievable, and the spiritual, let's say, emphasis had to revolve around, however, a body of a church, right? One that would be believed, right, to be beyond what the world was actually turning into. This was the substantial difference, because the world was decaying. So you must understand it in these terms, right? And this it's unfortunate that, say the secularized view of the world had kicked in already by the time of, say, the modern age, etc., not to realize the primal meaning of Catholicism within both the pagan empire that was a Catholic empire as pagan, and the Christian one later. because probably they would have been proud, of course, of our accomplishments to some degree, right? To others, they would be shocked and horrified. But the sense was that any given power, such as, I don't know, the nuclear one that we handle, it's still deriving from something that we succeeded in doing. That is also scientific, and it was in fact also compatible with that belief. But let's skip this specific aspect. The point, as we were saying before, is that the Alans adapted to the circumstances, right? There is an interesting example by the time of, say, Clovis' sons, right? When Saint Goar was born. Saint Goar is a Christian saint that eventually bears an Iranian, an Alan name. This guy was born in Aquitaine, so at the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century. And the interesting thing being that while he had an Alan name, as we've seen, there was a chieftain named Goar among the ones of the 5th century, protected Rome as well. His parents had been given Roman names. That is to say, these were Alans that, however, had adopted Latin names, but still honored their Alan heritage by naming their son Goar, so a typical Iranian name, right? So what it means is that his parents, or maybe even his grandparents, because counting the generations is possible, had accepted Catholicism, so rejecting the Arianism of the Visigoths that, as we've seen, were actually abandoned by the Alans in Aquitaine, as the latter sided with the Romans. His father was named Georgius, and his mother Valeria. Right, this from the Merovingian source of Goar's life. Maybe that Saint George, the dragon slayer, so a concept so, of course, close to Alan mythology as well, may have inspired the name that would remain a bit of a chivalric knightly tradition, right? The patron saint of these enterprises, and that's thus suited the character, at least of Goar's parents. Goar eventually went on in his life as a priest and a missionary, so he achieved sainthood. And this is interesting because it also shows this further step, right, towards a spiritual path that was, in part, we don't know whether driven by that sense of failure that would of humanity and the capacity of transfiguring alone. Remember what we said about the Alans. I mean, surely this guy's father or grandfather had believed again that if you didn't die in combat on a battlefield, you were just a lesser person, right? So we don't know what kind of say achievement Goar acquiring sainthood, of course, is attributed. We understand it in a ecclesiastical sense, but we don't have the voices of these people, and so it would be really fascinating to think of how he mixed his evangelical, his imitatio Christi with a sense of failure of the same arms, because that's the actual problem, as we were saying before, also with Buddhism and so on. It's the actual attempt to win the world by sheer power of the spirit, and without renouncing the world, however, and the possibility of achieving, right, of the importance of works that at this time are universally recognized, even in the most liminal fringes of Christianity. So we can assess the Alan conversion to Christianity to have been accomplished by the mid-6th century. Fortunatus, Venantius Fortunatus makes a point saying that the Alans were among other peoples that had been converted, and therefore there wouldn't be anything strange at that point. The Merovingians had taken over. They were Catholic, their warriors had converted to Catholicism, and the Alans had basically been incorporated within the Frankish realm, right? And especially the Merovingian seigneury over them. So, of course, we're talking about a transitional phase in which so much of the old ways were remembered, were still practiced. Again, especially from a military point of view, there was not another known fashion. Like the military had its own traditions that survived long enough. We see in the 7th century Byzantine Empire that basically those Greek soldiers had the same thrilling mentality about Achilles, the Iliad's heroes, the ethos, etc. And so very few Christian symbolism, but they fought under the Christogram, and they were Christians if you had asked them, right? They weren't, closet pagans. They actually believed, because again, it was the same concept, and how he achieved that is just eventually something is gonna take form in the world, and they thought that fighting was surely a way to do so. In fact, Christianity, by that point, I made lots of videos about this, had fully accepted that killing was in defense of Christendom was absolutely righteous, and defense here acquires also metaphysical sense, because it's not a matter of who physically attacks whom, but who morally attacks whom, and that's actually a very high principle. And we do not see any lack of warlikeness after Christianity. On the contrary, there's a very strict regulation of killing, of say penitence after killing, but still one that was quite seriously taken in consideration by the same warriors. Right? If you read the penitentials also in the West, among the Franks, the Normans, I mean, it was taken in an incredibly serious way, because they truly believed that killing was a sin, because it put an end radically, drastically, in a sense, as a failure of doing otherwise from a moral point of view that you would have had to be able to accomplish if you were really superior. A potentially infinite divine human spark, right, that was there for everybody to be redeemed. But you can't always allow others to do what they want just to give them an encouragement about being better people, right? Sometimes that's why we have a military. You just have to kill, right? This was perfectly logical and coherent. Just very stupid people today could think, look, the Christians said that they preached not to kill, and then they were okay they weren't okay, but they accepted at least that this would be possible and also rightful to some occasion. But what's wrong with the concept? Right? Unless you have the morality of, I think even when I was 4 years old, I didn't have such a simplistic or superficial morality. The truth is that you're just against quality, standards, tradition, divine superiority, because you are perfectly aware of your own limits, and you cannot accept it, right? You're incapable of dealing with that. These were people who dealt continuously with their own limits, and thus made these choices because to them they were as sullen as they could be. So, Christianization, the Romanization of names, these are all eloquent indicators of the Alan assimilation in Gaul. The Armorican question is fascinating as well. As we've seen, this region had been controlled by the Alans through their settlement at the frontier between what would become Neustria and, in fact, and Brittany. The Armoricans had never been particularly Romanized. Of course, they were primitive and poor, and there's not much that they could do in the first place. It's at this time they were replenished a bit demographically by the Romano-Brittonic people that were, swelling Wales and Cornwall, and in fact also taking ships to reach this frontier area. During late antiquity, however, this area had began at the outskirts of the empire to rebel. It saw the activity of the Bacaudae that were something, depending on the circumstance, very still rebellious, of course, but either as brigands or as a social revolt, or some sort of more warband-oriented phenomenon. Well, the islands were settled on that frontier to check them. They could also make troops arriving from Orléans through the Loire, and I made a video about medieval Brittany. We see how much, let's say, the Brittonic and Frankish side fought over those, especially areas in the south, on the mouth of the Loire, etc. We do not know exactly how many Alans were deployed on the American frontier. Some say no fewer than 15,000 people, just not only the warriors, right? Consider that the island population was militarized, so let's say for every warrior you could count, I don't know, just other couple of people, essentially, to be a bit conservative in numbers, but still something like that. This frontier had also gone depopulated, and the fact that we still find various family, personal, place names in the area connected with, in fact, the name Alain, and its variants Alain, Alan, etc. It really speaks volumes about the impact of the Alans there. So in this area north of the Loire, we find, for example, the name Gaul used more frequently, but we are pretty certain that toponomastically there was a strong presence of these warriors. And the interesting aspect of this is that they remained in this area still eccentric compared also to the later Merovingian power. So much so that they, as we'll see now, be assimilated by some sources, namely Procopius, to the same Armoricans. Right, so when we read Armoricans, actually we may think of this Romano-Brittonic, say, background, but also, loaded and led by some Alans who the Franks had to be wary of, right? So the not just this toponym Alanus stands out at the time, but so the Latinization of the term Aryan noble that it was opposed. We're not told specifically these are Alans, right? Procopius was also speaking from a bit of a distant perspective, so that, say, the assimilation might not be entirely clear to him, but in this passage it says the Armoricans had become soldiers of the Romans, and the Germans, wishing to make this people subject to themselves, since their territory had joined their own, and they had changed the government under which they had lived from old, began to plunder their land, and being eager to make war, marched against them with their woe people. But the Armoricans proved their valor and loyalty to the Romans, and showed themselves brave men in this war, and since the Germans were not able to overcome them by force, they wished to win them over and make the two peoples kin by intermarriage. This specific information is crucial because, aside from the fact that Armorica would school, for example, the Normans to equestrian warfare, etc., but at the time they had, again, definitely not much of a feudal ultra-elite profile. They were mostly lighter cavalry, quite agile, etc. So the Alans at late antiquity may have settled there and surely injected some kind of, say, equestrian knightly capacity, but they were the minority, and this system could not be sustained a longer time. But the fact that the Merovingians went at war with them, there were some clashes. This would be typical. I discussed this in the video about medieval Brittany. Is quite relevant. Also, the intermarriage between the German, the Franks, and the Armoricans, right? But the sense of valor and loyalty to Rome, etc., may be interpreted as the same in fact loyalty that the Alans had showed Rome back in the day, right? And so we don't have actually much information about how the Alans interacted with the Franks, especially after they took over by defeating the Alemanni and later on. But we do have at the beginning of the 6th century an instance with Clovis before leaving for the campaign of Vouillé against the Visigoths in Aquitaine. It would see effectively the Frankish victory over this people and essentially the withdrawal of, in fact, the Visigoths from the Atlantic watershed, right, of southwestern Gaul, right, just with Gothia, in fact, remaining as Septimania and other areas connected with Spain, where the main center had shifted, regardless of the conflicts with the Franks, were also in part of because of their rise, of course. You find Clovis preparing the expedition by first securing the area between the Seine and the Loire River, which was in fact the one of the frontier with the Alans, evidently, and so also the activity of these Armoricans that, however, at this point had surely joined forces with the latter, right? And this was obvious because if you had to invade Aquitaine, you had to operate in this western sector of Gaul, and if you were descending from Neustria, you needed your northwestern flank secured from possible ravages, say being cut out, right, from properly your supply lines in the northeast, right, where mostly the Franks had settled. And consider that there was the Loire in between, so it would have been actually a challenge to try to fix things at that point. But this was a victorious instance, and we can see this precedence given to the, let's call it the Alan frontier, by a man like Clovis that, as we explained countless times, was not exactly, the last of the achievers, also from a military point of view. This guy could split people's head like a cucumber without blinking an eye. Just the actual episode from the Vase of Soissons. So this respect between the Franks and the Alans is actually a quite relevant one. Also, we know that at the Battle of Vouillé, the Franks had a large number of horsemen, which were provided recently by these Armorican allies, who already had some sort of lighter cavalry tradition, but that was surely augmented by these Alan forces that in part had also, let's bear it in mind, like being hostile to the Armoricans, right? The Alans hadn't been settling in the far western end of the peninsula, but still in the most important areas in the southwest, between, in fact, the area of Nantes, for example, that were strategic and somehow also fertile, right? So that area could, as you know, also Brittany doesn't have much of a fixed border. It's a true frontier at that point, and it's likely that the Alans at Vouillé fought in the Merovingian ranks against the Visigoths, with whom, as we've seen, there had never been quite of a too warm feeling. It was there since they had defected them and somehow entered in full cooperation with Rome in some of the the best lands of Gaul, right? Even better than Aquitaine, where the Visigoths had been settled by the Romans. It's very interesting how Clovis also secured supplies before this campaign, because evidently there was an important amount of mounds for which grass and water had to be preserved. Gregory of Tours tells us quite clearly, ut nullus de regione illa aliud quam herbarum alimenta aquamque presumeret. So Clovis admonished not to essentially consume resources before, in other words, not to harvest them or to store them, or to render them more difficultly accessible before the army, the Merovingian army, would come at that point. He would have probably done it anyway, but considering the important equestrian load, you can think there that some of those resources still fed, at the beginning of the 6th century, a cataphract, among other horsemen, or maybe more than one cataphract. But this is fortunately lost in the mists of history. So what we've seen about the Alans in taking the wall, meaning here, they essentially established themselves as a lordship in the heart of Gaul, eventually getting absorbed by the local populace, but not before having absorbed their function, first of all, defense of the empire against the Huns, against the Bachaudai, and also against certain Germanic foederati that the Romans themselves thought to be essentially inferior to the Alans, right? Considering especially that the latter were outnumbered compared to the Germans, that were much more populous, but in that sense clumsy, right? And those weren't, people who killed either, right? They were quite militarized people. They were, by this point, especially essentially at the same level of the Roman army, or very slightly less than that. But in the West at that point, it was about the existence of a state. Like, as long as there is a Roman state functioning, there is the top military available, right? These guys take over the vestiges of that, and by some degree, and at least until the mid-6th century, so the big contraction of Eurasia because of the plague, because of just the fact that they had been fighting a lot, right? So some resources had been exhausted in the first place. Gaul was, as we've seen, more stable, but it wasn't quite peaceful just as such. So all these resources had to be adjusted, had to be in the way they were controlled by whom, and so on. So the Alans demographically were destined just to be diluted in the wall, because Gaul, again, was enormous, right? It was more populous than Italy. It was also richer than Italy in larger amount, say, absolute amount of wealth. But differently from Italy, or at least what Italy would have become with the Gothic War, in Gaul, a very few people owned almost the entirety of the system. So the concept of an elite that could also boast that cavalry that in Carolingian times had definitely surpassed the Longobards and also the Visigothic tradition before that, has a lot to do with the system, primarily with that. Surely, however, the Alans contributed to the preservation of that system. That was essentially the Roman one. It's somehow ironic in this, that the oligarchy that people think, the Germans arrived, they freed people, and absolutely not. They whenever they found a system that was, of course, more hierarchical, they adopted it entirely, right? It's just, the Longobards or the Anglo-Saxons that arrived in lands where the latifundium had been de facto destroyed, and so they had a more egalitarian society, also, especially the Longobards, civilly organized. In Gaul and in Spain, instead, what you have is this great landlords, feudal lords, and an incredibly private essence of what was still understood as a public culture in a Romano-Germanic fashion. So this is really crucial, and ultimately, even for all the videos that we made about Eurasian steppes warfare and historical unit types, etc., and we can perhaps observe this better in another video, the Alan influence, the Sarmatian, the Iranian influence as well, was quite strong in the further, say, completion of that knightly model that would arise, in our sense as such, in the Middle Ages to identify stereotypically medieval chivalry and cavalry, right? And the Alans were definitely the closest thing to that had existed in up to that point, right? And much was to evolve towards that direction in the first place, and especially in Gaul, right? Then, of course, Europe was entering a bit more of a feudal and private system, so that tradition of the stamps in medieval Europe was substantially leaving on, thanks to this, through osmosis, through assimilation, through literal settlement of nomadic elements, that in the case of the Alans were successfully civilized, differently from the Huns that were essentially just not capable of doing that, of settling somewhere, of running it, because they literally came from places that had never known civilization, while the Alans were living out at its outskirts from centuries, right? So the Huns disappeared. Surely they left a lot of traces as well, but mostly in Central, in Eastern Europe, right? In the West, surely they left a trace, but it's rightfully felt that the Alans here enter a bit more with a, if not with a red carpet, evidently, because the frozen Rhine is not a red carpet, telling the truth, but still with a greater reputation and a greater military quality, functionality, capacity to be, in fact, successfully integrated and assimilated like that, and to leave those traces, like the name of Alan that you can find in all these various French places, and not only. And that definitely shows you how even the local communities were proud of having been under these masters that surely at the beginning were discontenting more than someone, definitely, because they were truly barbarians, but barbarians that were intelligent and that succeeded in arranging matters in a way that would work on the base of the local rules. So chapeau to them. And a lot would require attention here comparatively also with other peoples that we're talking about here, but it's important because the Alans are not so recognized. Mostly we identified, like, say, I don't know, the France with the Franks, and also actually other chunks, the Visigothic and the Burgundian one, like half of France basically, plus Alemannia, given that was at least Elsa's part of the of Germany back in the day. That's a bit overlooked, but I know the Visigoths or the Suebi in the Iberian Peninsula, the Ostrogoths and the Longobards in the Italian one, the Anglo-Saxons in England, etc. Right? Well, just bear in mind that we're also these other people, and that are a bit of an exception, because I don't know any other group fundamentally that was sized like this, and also from that nomadic background, and that still had this high role and success at the same time. It is truly an exception. It does really show how qualitatively and virtuous the Alans were. And this goes in parallel with that astonishing military history that we know of, this sense of... But again, let's be also concrete about another aspects. These guys had been serving in the Roman military from a long time, right? The emperors, as we've seen, had uh, Alan bodyguards. Gratian, Theodosius, also Stilicho. I mean, they were really, a quoted thing, right? They had a very high reputation, and probably an overlooked aspect is also that there were so many war bands already roaming around, right? We often think of the Roman Empire like, I don't know, it was this big state with borders, and nothing was going on inside it. Of course, you could have found Sarmatian mercenaries here and there, just already living in a sort of civilized way. Otherwise, when the empire was already functional, they would have been cut down. And there have been instances, of course, of these bands first attacking the Romans, then being hired by them, and they were very proud. Like, just for the Germans as well, we know of some, I don't know, Danish in the sense, some Germanic warrior coming from the Jutland at some point, and having served in the Roman army, being quite proud about his clan, his tribe, but also the fact that he had been a Roman veteran. I think this is a beautiful thing that we don't embrace as Westerners, and that we don't understand because we have refused the imperial Catholic tradition, but that's what they all believed in. As pagans, as Christians, and I made surely lots of videos about this topic, but I want to make more, because you see, it is incredible. What are the odds of this story existing as such, evidenced by sources, right? You could have simply had the story of some Alans arrived, ravaged, and then were cut down, or they dispersed or assimilated, whatever. No, you have an actual history of discipline, of loyalty towards the empire, of rejection of a certain other model of destruction. You have the full assimilation. You have the respect won by the say from the Franks, by the Alans. So it's too perfect not to make sense, not to have a meaning, right? A universal one. And I think that's how we should recover the sense of military history, because otherwise, what do we study this thing for? Because you could say, but who the hell cares? Well, it's in the moment in which you understand this that it matters. That such an extraordinary city, such as Orléans, is one of the most beautiful cities of France, a bit the heart of it, right? The city of of the Pucelle, we could say, because she was actually Lorrainese, as you know, but did represent it in the victory during the 100 Years' War, like the coming back of the French monarchy, of its mystique, etc. This had been a center lorded over by the Alans that remained there, and you find so much of the Alan name in Western Europe, exactly in those areas, toponomastically, just in common people's names still today. Look, this is heavy, right? Because of course, there are other names that entered from, say, the time of the Germanic invasions. You can trace, etc. But the Alans weren't so many, and they didn't. Again, they never had, or they did have at the time, presumably, but at best a provincial scale. Say state is a big word, but still some seigneury was recognized as a polity out there. We don't see them on the maps of the migration era that we drew later, because we didn't consider them as important as the Germanic kingdoms, that admittedly were more important, there is no doubt, but that they still played this role of balance, right? It's sure that most of Gallo-Roman civilization and great part of French greatness was actually preserved and protected and, let's say, catalyzed by these people. And we have barely any recognition for. Of course, there are books, there are articles on these topics. I'm not saying that we don't. History studies almost everything, and also recognize this. But when you get to pop culture, you do not really find much of the story, right? Instead, I think it's a very interesting one, and reason for which I hope we will talk especially about the Sarmatians in Britain, because that is somehow, as you know, related to the Arthurian cycle, also all something that re-emerged. Think about the Nibelungen. Right? These were all stories actually of the migration era, eventually popping up again as at least written tradition that was eventually orally preserved across all those centuries, because they thought that this had been the great critical time that was worth telling of, even as a disastrous, terrible one, right? They're all sad, dramatic stories. I mean, the Nibelungs are massacred. Arthur dies finally. There is that impending sense of the doom of, that is typical of the eschatological perspective of all these peoples, and so the military cult. So we got these stories a bit more gallantly and chivalrily adapted to literary and aesthetical tastes, but they were talking about essentially the cosmic struggle, the holy war. Right, and these people were bringing it. Right, you can imagine it. Even, I mean, in spite of all the tragedies, I mean, just think about the beauty of that world, without pollution, without lights, without, the beauty of the French countryside in the 5th century. The sky. These people venerated the heaven because Earth was product of the fall. Just think about what the sky was at the time. Something incredible, right? Well, all right, we will hopefully cover these topics at some other point. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.